In Grahamstown, Ohio. Yeah, I think was a happening thing today in Grahamstown. So thank you so much for all this. We really appreciate it. Today we're going to have this panel on life writing. And we have 3 speakers. I'll give them 20 minutes each to give a presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers, and comments and suggestions at the end. Just to give you some kind of background into, information about what's happening. So after this session, it's going to be, there's nothing really. They're going to, okay, there is something. The people here, but it's happening here, it's games. You're going to play games you played in your childhood. I hope they have hopscotch. Do you remember hopscotch? Do you know? Yeah. So it's going to be one of those kind of afternoons, nothing much, except that there will be tea around there for you to have and snacks. But then later on in the evening at 7:30, we'll all gather again to have dinner at Steve Biko. So I hope you know where that is, the Steve Biko building. So make your way there. If you want to dress up, you can dress up. That's fine. Huh?
Bring my hat, Linda. You must bring my hat, ne?
Your hat? Which
hat.
one? But then also...
My DJ hat.
Oh, I forgot that. Oh, you have a nice hat. I think we will borrow Chantelle's hat. And Tando is the DJ. And bring your playlist, because if you don't like Afro-pop, that's my playlist. You sit there listening to Wizkid, Azonto, Jabaj the whole day, so that's my playlist. So if you don't want, bring your own, because it's going to be kind of, happy and all that. It's time to let our hair loose. Is it loose? It's very loose. What do I say? Let my hair, my fro airy. Don't listen to any of this stuff. Okay, listen, on to the serious business of today. Life writing. Today we have Chantelle, who is from one of my places I miss dearly, Stellenbosch University. But I don't know Chantelle. Chantelle doesn't know me.
No.
So yes, Chantelle's from Stellenbosch. She's going to be our first speaker, and then Ranka, and is my partner in crime in a whole lot of things. She's here visiting us in the English department as part of my Melon-funded project and giving me and my students things to think about that you don't want to think about. But yes, Ranka is so much fun. You'll be seeing her in Stellenbosch soon. So keep a note of that. And then here is my very new BFF. She doesn't know that, but I'm claiming her. Masola. She ran away from the English department and somehow
You know that story. There we know now.
But all of a sudden, her and her friend Tulani are finding themselves back because it's not so bad after all, is it? So Atta is in the Department of African Languages here as a PhD student, but she works at UCT, at Pretoria. Ranka is from Southampton, and yes. So, yeah. Chantelle is from Stellenbosch. Okay, guys, let's have fun. Chantelle, you are the first.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Thank you. So just some background, this is part of my master's, current ongoing master's research, the very beginnings of that. Quote, what I resent most, however, is not his inheritance of power he so often disclaims, disengaging himself from a system he carries with him, but his ear, eye, and pen, which record in his language while pretending to speak through mine on my behalf. End quote, Trinmina. I'm sitting with a cup of coffee and a cigarette on a grey garden chair. It's dark. My computer casts a blue light. I've tried to start explaining this project to you for nearly 4 or 5 times. The practice of writing is, it's too dry, this project started, that's not right, and so on and so forth. But I keep interrupting myself, because lingering in my mind is a fading memory of the perfect opening line that dawned on me the night before. Seduced by the warmth and the comfort of my covers, I fooled myself into thinking that I'll remember in the morning and that there's no need to write it down. I remember wanting to tell you a few reasons why I started this project, the first of which was the frothing mouth frustration with my writing project that preceded this one. In 2016, I conducted a study about the experiences of black and white lesbians in Stellenbosch to unearth some of the silences that exist around race and gendered queerness. The project was close to my heart since I was writing about my own community of queer women and the town in which I live and work. Throughout the research project, I read about the lives of queer humans, and it was refreshing to see that at long last my community was being written about. But an uneasy feeling irked me. Why are queer humans only written about as humans that are constantly in the grips of some oppressive struggle? Very little writing shows the joys of being queer, and that queer humans exist as people that experience both hardship and joy. After the study was done and dusted, I was still uneasy, restless, constantly bothered by the feeling that the project was not finished, that I had not done justice to the women that I wrote about. I soon realized that I had committed the very crime that had frustrated me so much throughout my research. Another frustration looked over my shoulder. Had I written myself into the text? Had I really considered myself and my own identity in interviewing and writing about these women? As a white queer woman interviewing white and black lesbians, I had to stand in front of the mirror and identify myself as being white, Afrikaans, able-bodied, queer, woman, writer, and for that moment also listener. Reflecting on these sharing moments revealed the revolutionary act of resilience and reclaiming our lives as meaningful, the radical nature of something that seems as simple as asserting our voice and claiming space, of rejoicing in the meeting of intersecting identities. I had witnessed the unearthing of untold narratives and a draining of pus from wounds of the survivors and enactors of trauma, but my listening was incomplete, because I have yet to attend to the wounds of the survivors and the enactors of trauma. I had seen that they were not only wounds, they were stitches and sutures, scars and unblemished skin. The question remains, what is the role of the listener? What does attending to survivors look like? What of the pus that had leaked from the wounds and onto the pages of my research? What of the resilience and the life that I bore witness to? Of course, I didn't remember that perfect opening line. I wanted to start with, and I still don't. Then again, writing, for me at least, always seems to be birthed from a frustration with or a celebration of something. The act of writing is almost always the act of rewriting or rephrasing knowledge and ideas that already exist, in the hope that this reconfiguring, this arrangement of knowledge could illuminate something new about the human condition. After all, writing is an attempt to use language to mediate the ideas of the writer that we pluck from our stream of consciousness. Trinity Mina echoes this in saying that, quote, writers usually write to create a world of their own, make order out of chaos, heighten their awareness of life, transcend their existences, discover themselves, communicate their feelings, or speak to others. Writing, end quote, writing then requires the writer to write with the text, to become as the text becomes, and not to write themselves as existing before, after, or above the text. Writers, and any users of language, are however shackled by the linearity of language that suggests a beginning, a middle, and an end, and can only articulate our inner world through this linearity. Because just as, quote, sketched windows have their own realities, writing as a system by itself has its own rules and structuring processes, end quote, Mina. This linearity is further reinforced, especially in academic writing, by the didactic nature in which we've been trained to write. Instead, I'm interested in bending language, in sentences that only suggest an end, that are left incomplete. I'm interested not in complete sentences as complete sentences, but rather in how the words in the sentences exist in relation to one another, the other meaning a word suggests, gestures towards or implies, how words and sentences can be freed from linearity and instead be woven as threads in a web, a tapestry. Like Mina, quote, I see no interest in adopting a progression that systematically proceeds from generalities to specificities, from outlines to fillings, from diachronic to synchronic, or vice versa. I am profoundly indifferent to his old way of theorizing, of piercing, as he often claims, through the sediments of psychological and epistemological depths, end quote. Wedded to this inherent inability of language and writing to articulate the meshwork of our minds, it is what readers bring to the text. Barthes describes the text and says that there's one place, quote, where this multiplicity is collected and united, and this place is not the author, as we have thereto said it was, but the reader. The reader is the very space in which we are inscribed, without any being lost all the citations a writing consists of. The unity of a text is not in its origin, it is in its destination, end quote. This suggests that texts do not exist as one unity, but take on multiple forms of unity, a multiplicity of unity, as it encounters multiple readers and the multiplicity that exists within each reader. The writer can therefore never truly determine the meaning of our own texts. A text, once released into the world, grows, it morphs and takes on a new shape. It reflects, refracts, and bends light, the color of which the writer can never control. It is in this light space that the reader reads themselves into the text. How will the reader twist the kaleidoscope? How will the light refract in the tubes if it's adjusted this way or that? What pattern picture will the reader see when they turn the text in on itself to reflect on itself? It's here that fictocriticism slips into the corner of my eye, into the corner of my consciousness, while I frantically search for answers to my questions. I look down on the red bricks that map the sides of each Stellenbosch road, veins coursing with bodies, leading the bodies to their destinations. In between each brick, plants reach out for air. Gardeners toil tirelessly to invisibilize these. First they trim, if this proves vain, they pick and earth the bricks and uproot the growth. Sweat drips from their forehead, feeding the dry earth with their DNA. The sun bounces off the sheen. I don't know why these plants are so stubborn, but at the waxing of each new moon they reveal themselves again. Stronger this time, more stubborn. The roots lie deeper than what we can reach. The sweat nurtures them, the persistence of the sweat droplets. The persistence of the offering breeds persistence. They cannot allow the feet that trample to forget what lurks underneath the surface. The sweat drips to feed the bottom of the core. They reach out to bask in sunlight, thirsting to bask in the light of day. If left to grow, will they re-envelop man's superimposition of red bricks, of shoot feet, of axe picks? The moist soil resists even in the darkness. I was supposed to explain fictocriticism, wasn't I? If the red bricks were the writing that is seen and known to us, I suppose fictocriticism would be the plants, a mode of writing that aims to write the margins, the footnotes, the in-between, articulating instances where poeticalness, quote, is not primarily an aesthetic response, nor literariness merely a question of pure verbalism, and instances where the borderline between the theoretical and non-theoretical writing is blurred and questioned, so that theory and poetry necessarily mesh, both determined by an awareness of the sign and the destabilization of the meaning and writing subject, to be lost, to encounter impasse, to fall, and to desire both fall and impasse. Isn't that what happens to the body in theory? End quote, Mina. As a necessarily hybrid mode of writing, it takes on, fictocriticism takes on qualities of fiction and qualities of critical writing. Farrar writes it as a series of quote, readings and rereadings which establish a practice of critical fictionalizing and a fictionalizing of the critical. And as such, a fictocritical text both interrupts the monolithic architecture of the text through the technique of cut and stitch, and also by reading between the lines of the novel, provides an alternative reading, a space for other voices, other texts, end quote. The orifices of the body of writing, which includes fictional and critical writing, have been clogged by the constant ejaculation of phallocentric writing. Tissot writes of the manner in which nearly the entire history of writing is confounded with the history of reason, of which it is at once the effect, the support, and one of privileged alibis. It has been one with the phallocentric tradition. It is indeed that same self-admiring, self-stimulating, self-congratulatory phallocentrism. This allegiance to the phallocentric tradition in the history of writing has created a division between the logic of oral speech and the logic of writing, and separating the latter as mutually exclusive from the former. This separation confines the narrative of queer humans to the shadowy margins and therefore to silence, since the phallocentric tradition does not value voice narratives as legitimate. The resurrection and the importance of the reader therefore not only unclogs the orifices of the body of writing, it creates a space for the marginal human to claim our voice. Fictocritical writing does not only aim to disrupt and unclog, but also aims to produce and regulate the flow of fresh air through the orifices that were previously blocked. Much like how the plants in between the red bricks are not only aiming to disrupt and resist the superimposition of man on nature, it also aims to replace the superimposition with itself. This flow of fresh air is critical to sustain the life of academic and public discourse. Academic discourse, specifically intersectional feminist theory, should strategize and think through ways in which to create a society that is free of discrimination and aim to write against the systems that are at the very core of this discrimination and that contaminates and corrupts the very freedom of humans. As it stands, however, quote, academics' texts reduce their subjects of analysis to fixed meanings and readings. This is achieved by the reductive and dialectic style of scholarly writing, as it discards any elements that distract from the more often than not linear argument. If the detractors are not discarded, they are swiftly dealt with, proven to be aberrant, incorrect, or just irrelevant. End quote. This rigorous approach to writing the subject, informed by phallocentric writing, therefore does not make space for the fluidity and paradoxical nature of human identity and reality, and does not allow for leakage and excess. Indeed, phallocentrism hides women and the stories that burst from them, and confines us to rooms, the walls of which are covered with mirrors, faced with the reflections that phallocentrism has conditioned us to read only in the sanguine light of disdain that leaves a rusty aftertaste in my mouth, as I lick up discharge leaking from my genitals. How else must I clean it than with my tongue in this room to which I have been isolated? This I is entirely ignored in phallocentric writing that currently dominates academia and does not allow for the personal, the self, to be inserted into the text. This positions the academic as the objective third party, devoid of the identity and experiences from which they write. As such, the current state of academic writing does not allow the subject any entry point. Without an exchange between and communication with the public and creative writing, academic writing becomes an ivory tower engaged in intellectual masturbation, and in its inaccessibility to all those things, or to those things outside academia, it becomes relevant only unto itself, perpetuating the very othering it's meant to counter. Indeed, quote, theory no longer is theoretical when it loses sight of its own conditional nature, takes no risks in speculation, and circulates as a form of administrative inquisition. Theory oppresses when it wills or perpetuates existing power relations, when it presents itself as a means to exert authority, the voice of knowledge, end quote, Mina. To open up communication between academic and public discourse, a brick-by-brick dismantling of the ivory tower that academia has become is vital. If inaccessible to public discourse, academic discourse, specifically intersectional feminist theory, becomes useless and excessive. If academic discourse, again specifically intersectional theory, is not continually informed by lived experience, can it be called intersectional feminist theory? What purpose does it then serve? Fictocriticism seems to be the most productive way of writing to let flow the parts of the body, to let flow the subterranean water, to unblock the stagnant river that will restore blood flow to those deadened parts of the bodies, awakening what has been hidden, silenced, forgotten, or deadened and used newly restored limbs to complete the act of listening, to write myself into the text, a mode of writing from and toward women. It becomes increasingly clear that fictocriticism can be figured as a very necessary tool to advance the decolonial project. Thank you.
You can continue.
Oh no, I'm done.
No, but we were still enjoying that. You still have time. Chantelle,
Yes.
is that how you
Yes.
pronounce it? Thank you so much for that. Very innovative. I mean, it made me think about a lot of things. Ranka?
Made me think about a lot of things too. But before I say some of them, just to thank everyone, this conference, Rhodes Uni, the Mellon Foundation, Linda, the organizers of today, for having me. It's been a huge privilege to be here. And Chantelle, thanks for that paper, in which I've remarked, in particular, your metaphor towards the beginning of pus leaking out of rooms. Everything you said about textuality and self-writing of the subject resonates with, I think, with what I have to say too, but this metaphor is a good introduction to what I have to say about a book written by a woman which is in very different genre to what you just performed. So let me start with a quote too. This is a tale of suffering. Coping with the unrelenting illness of a beloved, facing the bleakness of bereavement, a partial loss of oneself, struggling from the depths of misery to resist opportunistic snatches of household property, acting under the guise of tradition. It is a tale born out of the biggest injustice of life, that however sweet and beautiful life may be, it always finally ends in death. Norah Mumba, the author of these words, now in her 70s, is, alongside Monde Sifuniso and Buyu Nolomango, one of the foundational feminist figures of post-colonial Zambia. Norah spent her working life as a librarian at the University of Zambia. She's done very many very important things. She's co-founded the Zambian Women Writers Association. She's a prize-winning author of plays, short stories, and poetry, a newspaper columnist, and a still active public intellectual today. The snippet I've just read is a fair summary of, as well as a quote from, the book that helped to propel Norah into public prominence in her country, a memoir of widowhood called A Song in the Night, subtitled A Personal Account of Widowhood in Zambia. And it bears witness to and speaks out against the frequently ruthless dispossession of Zambian widows in the name of tradition, whereby her husband's family helped themselves to the property of the deceased man to the disadvantage of his wife and children, who have no say in the matter. A practice which Norah Mumba's activist engagement helped to make illegal, and it's illegal to do this in Zambia today. The book's preface refers to the Interstate Succession Act No. 5 of 1989, and I know from conversations with the author herself that she has helped to bring this about, although she doesn't say this in the book, because it's the book itself that helped to bring it about. The book is now out of print, and this is only one of many reasons why it's not meant to exist as an object of academic inquiry, and least of all as an object of literary inquiry, which is what I'm going to attempt now. It was published by Multimedia Publications in Lusaka, one of several independent publishers that sprang up in Zambia towards the end of and immediately after Kenneth Kaunda's mandate as a president. If we'd seen it on bookshop shelves, it might have looked unremarkable to us. All of Zambia's publishers are struggling, every single one. The country has no viable publishing sector, nor not linked to the textbook market, and even that is heavily subsidized in various kinds of ways. But it's a rich and subtle text, to my mind, which could easily support any number of trendy readings back at home, at my university, and the country where I'm based. So as rereading it for this paper, I was thinking, oh, this could be a medical humanities paper, or I could write a law and literature paper. But I'm not going to I didn't write any of either of those papers. Instead, I want to say something about two interrelated sets of implications, harder to discern, I think, from a vantage point outside of Zambia. One of them is related to genre, the other to the book's feminist critique of the Zambian nation. By way of framing both of these points of interest, let me just insert two quick explanatory digressions here. Number one, Zambia's modernity is not secular, not even officially. The country inscribes itself in its own constitution as a Christian nation. It's always built its own sense of united nationhood around the twin pillars of Christianity and the English language, and this, by the way, is a successful nationalist project. It is a united nation, with 70 plus tribes, as people there say. and as many languages, of course. Norah Mumba's female narrator is a practicing Christian in a context where this subject position is unmarked. This is unremarkable. She doesn't go into detail of the denominational variety of her faith in the book. Second digression. The system of prose genres that governs locally produced Zambian literature in English, by which, when I say system of genres, I mean the local economy of prose forms, how they are related to one another in terms of social functioning, and the manner in which they derive from other forms. So local prose ecosystem, okay, textual system, revolves around their practical and moral usability. I realize that this is a very broad statement. It would take an entire separate paper for me to properly substantiate it. I will write that paper, I haven't written it yet. But when I do write it, I will want to make 3 interrelated claims. Number 1, when it comes to publishing local fiction locally, neither publishers nor readers nor educational institutions can afford firmly to separate texts narrative texts, that is, prose texts, meant for our aesthetic or leisure enjoyment. Okay, so what sometimes in Europe we mean automatically to mean literature. They can't separate that kind of text and that kind of specialized reading from, and sorry, I now have to find my place, hold that thought. They can't make it distinct from producing texts for school use. So local publishers, what I'm saying is the minute something becomes a book, it almost becomes a classic, especially if it's a local book. A publisher once told me unthinkingly, without thinking it too much, but it's a book, therefore it's a classic, and therefore it's going to be taught at schools. Sure. Not an absolute overlap, but a very large overlap. 2, life writing and fiction are often formally related. Fine, we know that from other contexts. But in Zambia, both are often subordinated to the need to provide explicit moral instruction to readers. And 3, my last point, the moral functionality of text is not firmly separated either from practical usability, so it could be a manual of some sort, for example, let's say a self-help book or an entrepreneurial manual, or a book about how to find the right life partner, that kind of thing, how-to thing, books, or nationalist pedagogies. All of those are very frequently bound into one. This begs a lot of questions about how Zambian readers read. My hunch is that they are very subtle readers. They're very sophisticated readers who can do many things with a single text. Okay? But that's the other paper I have not written yet. To return to my current paper, let me say that so that when Norah Mumba says so this book enters this kind of system, all right? And it's a Christian book, but nobody thinks that's remarkable. So when Norah Mumba says, and that's why also the book can't be found anymore. All of these texts are ephemeral. Sometimes they come back onto the market, sometimes they don't. But I should say it's a system that is stable. It's not going anywhere. We shouldn't worry that this is disappearing. It's beautiful local culture that's going to go away. They found, like the rest of the Zambian economy, it's kind of stably active at low level. People are surviving and books are getting produced. So when Norah Mumba says in the preface to A Song in the Night that it's a tale of suffering, in the bit that I just read to you, she's signaling many things to her Zambia-based readers. She's signaling the possibility of a coming alignment in her text, which indeed does come, between a representation of a gendered subjectivity, some version of Christianity, and some version of nationalist pedagogy. She may also, it turns out, be leaving a proleptic marker of her engagement with a certain specific way of constructing a narrative. More on this in a minute. And since I have said in my abstract that I sent to Linda that I'm going to read this text as a feminist manifesto, I should now add that Mumba herself describes the scope of intellectual commitment, her scope of her intellectual commitment to feminism, with extra care in the 3rd chapter of this memoir. She writes, I'm not an anti-feminist. Okay, I'm not anti-feminist. With reasonable bounds, of course, and I'm very proud of what I can contribute to society. I believe there is no intellectual difference whatsoever between men and women. Genius comes in both sexes. But she adds, and here I'm paraphrasing because that paragraph is quite long, There's a physical difference between men and women, which is one of God's wonders of creation. The institution of marriage is sacred, as per Jesus' teachings. There is nothing demeaning in being someone's wife, and a wife should be proud of her role as mother of the family and a partner to her husband. Everyone would be happier than they are if they were all to stick to our roles and put in all our worth. We can only cause ourselves discontent if we attempt to force ourselves to be what we were not destined to be. She goes on, please do not misunderstand me. I'm not advocating supremacy of the male sex to the detriment of the female. That is an equally unacceptable state of affairs. Let us all be proud of our God-given roles and realize our full potential. In the face of your reactions, I'm actually not judging this. This is her position, okay? And I don't think it's funny. It's her position in her own context. She has done remarkable things in that context, unlike me in mine. She's also had to be strategic in that context. It's easy to see the limits of this position, that I grant you. Some things are simply not natural, okay? That doesn't. It's less easy to see the local politics of this statement. I don't know how Norah would have read or spoken this to a public audience, say at a book launch, if she had ever done it, or if she had to do it. Zambia is deeply patriarchal country, okay, but it's got its own kind of patriarchy. So I'm doing my very best to read this book as I am able to read it from the outside. In this book, then, we get a representation of a gendered body whose will to change the world does not manifest itself in pushing back against the injustice of dispossession at the moment it occurs. She takes it. But enduring the kind of suffering which comes out of a prolonged confrontation with death. The narrative of this suffering is couched in a well-established local form that allows its political implications to be immediately culturally processed, I think, by its readers. The book narrates, in an occasionally witty and very often moving literary style, the protracted illness and death of leukemia of Norah Mumba's husband, Dr. Stanley Kabamba Mumba. As Norah and Stanley, a young, educated, middle-class, model Zambian couple, blissfully happily married, along the lines of the gender division of labour that she deems to be natural, of course, with 3 small children, they return from the UK, where Stanley got his PhD, and he develops a series of medical symptoms which gets progressively worse, and which the book describes in excruciating detail. Here's your metaphor. Mumba states at the outset that she feels life is like a book, a text which unfolds incrementally in clearly marked sections or chapters. In her own chapters titled Diary of an Illness, readers learn about, and here comes a list. The mucus that invades his throat and ears when he gets sick, diarrhea, vomiting, hot flushes, weight loss, phenomenally intense headaches, abdominal swelling, a diagnosis of pulmonary tuberculosis, and then itchy skin, aching joints, weight loss, fever, more headaches, ringing and pain in the ears, dizzy spells, sores around the mouth, mental impairment, and finally death. This has obvious allegorical, this narrative is very painful to read, has obvious allegorical potential. He's a saint of sorts who has just died, but the claim is, and I have no reason not to believe it, that all of this something happened, that actually happened, and it went undiagnosed for a very long period of time. It is an excruciating read, and this is the point. The illness of Mumba's husband amounts to torture, but it also amounts to a systematic testing of Stanley's manhood, of his devotion to his family, and of Norah's love and support. His death, when it finally comes, thus paradoxically amounts to a victory, proof of their love, endurance, and faith. The book makes this explicit. I know that we could not have handled our situation the way we did, the narrator says, had we had the foreknowledge that death was waiting for him around the corner. No, emphatically no. You see, we got through by our faith. Christian narratives of ordeal, that is to say, protracted suffering that tests the protagonist's fidelity, valor, bravery, virtue, nobility, sanctity, and so on, this is a quote from Bakhtin, have played an important part in writing in this part of the world since the colonial era. Ordeal plotlines are central to very many things. Among other things they're written about, they're central to the crisis, so-called crisis, that we have just witnessed not too far away from here in Zimbabwe. They are central also to the process of building the Zambian nation. In 1971, in Dominic Mulaisho's novel The Tongue of the Dumb, the first Zambian novel to make it to Heinemann's African Writers series, there are three characters in there: an African Christian schoolteacher, a village woman, and a European Jesuit priest, who undergo protracted periods of abuse, deprivation, and pain, in one case death, in order to make a political reconciliation between an African village community and a Jesuit mission nearby possible. This reconciliation in turn comes to allegorize Zambians coming to nationhood. Mulaisho's novel, so this is another author, okay, canonical Zambian author to whom I'm referring, is partly inspired by Achebe's Arrow of God, and I have written about this at length elsewhere. And in that article I called this novel a frontline cosmopolitan novel, but I also qualified it. I said that this cosmopolitanism was bounded because of its patriarchal orientation. This is the text that I'm reading Norah Mumba's memoir against. Norah Mumba's memoir maps an ordeal as a kind of narrative which her readers would have known, because those stories have been in the region since Pilgrim's Progress has been translated into indigenous languages. So Norah Mumba's memoir maps an ordeal as a kind of narrative structure onto the timeline of her own biography. At the end of Mulaisho's ordeals, the male author, a mute child symbolically comes to speak, a triumph that symbolizes Zambia's newfound nationhood. Similarly, for Mumba, protagonist and her husband, the ordeal of illness culminates in the death, which is also a victory of sorts, as I've tried to explain. Mumba's ordeal is, however, not followed by closure. You don't get a happy ending. Okay, in the male writing you get a new baby is born, new baby is not born, but a mute baby starts to speak. We get United Zambia. But in this feminist memoir, what comes instead of closure is another supplementary ordeal, which is protracted, unwarranted, and narrated in the chapter titled The Aftermath, through which the narrator, now a young widow, is stripped of the household objects, as I've explained, which is had with her husband while they were living together in England. And these objects, amidst Zambia's poverty, these household items had marked the couple out as successful and modern. She's stripped of her status as a modern woman when they take away her a point of particular pain is that take away her fridge. And the book, which is sometimes unexpectedly funny, is peppered with bitter and wry remarks about how she couldn't give her kids a cool drink that was cold because their fridge had been inherited away from them by avaricious relatives. The narrator endures this second ordeal too, but while she went willingly along with the first ordeal, now she resists, because what is happening to her is not natural. It's a perversion. So she refuses to wail during the funeral ceremony, forgets to cover her hair at the funeral, and has nothing but ironic outrage when she's faced with accusations of witchcraft. Her subsequent critique of the avaricious, immoral members of her husband's family slides into an openly political critique of Kaunda's Zambian humanist frontline cosmopolitan, my word, nation, which she argued can be accused of similar kinds of hypocrisy as the relatives who took her home apart. It's a big indictment of our society, she writes, that we express contentment with this state of affairs by refusing to pass a law to help stamp it out. People are eager to join battles being fought in far-off lands, while they pathetically fail to put their own house in order first. If the plight of widows and orphans was given even half the attention that is abundantly showered on, for example, apartheid, I would be singing a different tune now. Now, this is contentious terrain. Zambia is proud and has been proud to be a frontline state. Okay, it's invested an awful lot of all kinds of resources into into fighting white supremacy in this country and in Zimbabwe on humanist grounds. I don't know what happened after this book. I don't know whether she's in any trouble after this was published. But my point here is that Mumba's political protest is couched in a narrative grammar well established locally and fully familiar to her readers. And then the last thing for me to consider is how she steps out of this temporality of suffering, which is she's in effect taken apart. Okay? She's done what feminists all over the world have done, which is to turn male narratives against themselves and say, fine, okay, if this is the logic of us being free, then why are women exempt from that narrative logic? She steps out of the temporality of suffering and into the realm of self-change brought about by political action that was performed for her through the act of writing, which the book itself embodies but does not represent. If life is like a book, then the production of her own book amounted for Mumba to a rebirth. As a public figure and an independent subject, a woman who lives alone with her children, an unmarried woman, a widow, who proactively begins to change her social world with a certain appropriately timed series of steps. First, the acceptance of suffering, then her rejections of suffering, and then abandoning the very narrative of suffering. The temporal figure of rebirth is summoned in the book twice to describe the moment her husband died, where it's a long passage, I didn't put it in my paper, but she kind of says, look, birth is really difficult for babies, it's really traumatic. Also, there goes that entire metaphor of new country being born, children beginning to speak miraculously. She said, yeah, I was reborn, but it nearly killed me. The final moment that And then there's another moment of rebirth when she and her children escape from their former home, now occupied by hostile relatives. The book allegorizes incremental transformation. Okay, so it's what I would normally in a literary talk be tempted to call Bildung, but this isn't Bildung as we know it from mainstream lit. Okay, this comes in chapters, in incremental stages. The final moment of what amounts to a progression via change of direction is submerged in the text itself, but implied in its very existence. Mumba's use to this Christianity-infused temporal framework, ordeal, which we all know, this kind of story, does not allow for a representation of gradual secular subjectivity change. And yet the incremental set of rebirth or conversions she experiences amounts undeniably to a kind of historical and social emergence. I'll skip a bit here. There's a bit of theorizing here which I'll skip to read you one final quote from her book. She says that after she was widowed, everybody looked down on her, but she felt superior to married women who looked at me as someone with an infirmity. But you see, I have once been married, and now I have graduated to a higher status. I read these lines as a sly admission that she is now, in some senses, freer than she was when she was married, despite her earlier exaltation of the married state. Social change was, in Mumba's case, accomplished both through her body and her text. It's perhaps not surprising that when I last spoke to Norah Mumba in Osaka, in her Osaka living room a couple of years ago, she was now completely, in her 70s, completely comfortable with the label feminist. More here, but I think I need to stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ranka. Now, listen to Attack's paper.
I'm not going to kind of do a lot of work. Actually, let me say this. I've got disclaimers to make. And I'm not going to do a lot of the biographical stuff to explain Noni, because I tried to do that in the abstract, so hopefully people have read that in order to help me engage with this paper. And so part of the disclaimer is that when I first started telling people about this paper, everyone started telling me that I need to read The Production of Space, which is by this French guy whose name I can't pronounce. She knows how to pronounce his name. And I got the book out from the library, I looked at the contents page, I was like, yes, no. So I kind of parked it and I looked at other stuff that people had written about him. Then I came across a book actually that has the title Ekhaya, which is edited by Megan Healy Clancy, and I was very drawn to it because it's about people writing about their conceptions of home in using KZN as a space. So I was really excited. So when I looked through her book, she's now using Bourdieu, that other French guy. And he's writing, and they use his idea of habitus to explain this idea of Ekhaya. So I'm coming into this paper being very uncertain about what to do with this kind of theoretical location. And I guess I brought it to this colloquium because I wanted to be grounded in theory that is by black women, effectively. And I'm hoping you're going to help me think through that because that's where I kind of am. So because I couldn't quite find the people that I was looking for to help me make sense of what I'm writing, I then start using language as a way to then locate the paper. And I've been told that it's not quite enough. Someone also suggested that I look at intersectionality, and somehow I'm not convinced by it. Someone needs to convince me that I should use intersectionality to explain what I'm trying to do here. So it's part of a larger PhD project, which is probably going to be a section of the analysis chapter. I wrote it because I didn't want to start the theory chapter, which I was told to start, because I just didn't know how to start it. So I thought, let me write something about this book, because I need to write something as part of the project. So it's going to feed into that anyway. So I start with one of my favorite quotes about home that Bongani Madondo uses in his book when he's writing about Brenda Fassie and the journey that he goes through in trying to find and locate Brenda Fassie. So he says, what remains as a constant, however, is the realization that the story of modern-day South Africa is also the story of the perennial search for home. Every black African, everywhere, is rightly or wrongly perceived to originate, a contentious concept in itself, from somewhere. Almost overwhelmingly, that somewhere is consensually assumed, indeed believed, to be an idyllic village perched somewhere far away in rural crevices. Even today, when someone asks you in the city or at a dinner table somewhere in a little town where you come from, your heart beats a millisecond faster than before. Does he want to know where I pay my taxes and my children go to school, or where my folks, mainly my grandparents, come from? So this is the kind of quote that drives me in terms of understanding this idea of home. So Madondo makes various claims about home which are not immediately obvious to those who do not share this experience. Firstly, black Africans are seen to have been in search of homes since the disruption of colonialism in the form of the frontier wars, which culminated in the Land Act of 1913, which displaced many African people in South Africa from their ancestral homes. This legislation rendered many black people homeless, displaced, and in effect as not belonging to the South African project, which was established with the advent of the Union of South Africa in 1910. Secondly, through the legislation of Bantustans, which allocated black people to a homeland based on their language and culture, it meant that black Africans did not in fact belong to South Africa, but originated in the homelands, which were not part of the Republic of South Africa. This contentious concept of originating highlights the displacement of black Africans in a region where they are the indigenous people. Moreover, the prospect that black Africans can move freely and claim to be from many places is withheld from them by virtue of the Bantustans as well as the Group Areas Act. Thirdly, Madondo highlights the idea of imagined home as an idyllic village far from the city because apartheid legislation reserved the city for white progress and cheap black labor rather than as a place where black people belonged. This becomes the unsettled nature of home, which black African people contend with constantly because of the past of apartheid and colonialism, which are still a reality. However, this is not the full extent of the conflict of home. If Madondo were a black woman, he would also have to contend with the question of home before and after marriage. For black women, particularly Xhosa women, home becomes a negotiation after marriage. This is both a physical negotiation between two places, but also a linguistic negotiation. Before a woman marries, her home is referred to as Ekhaya. This can be the home of the matriarch or the patriarch in the family. Other families refer to this as undlunkulu, the big house or the main house where all the families gather. Once a woman marries, she is sent to nasemzini, the home of marriage. This move is accompanied by rituals and is seen as the main rite of passage for women. where the rite of passage for men is initiation, for women it's marriage and having children. There are other rituals that I describe in the longer paper which speak more to the establishment of the distinction between Ekhaya and Mzi. In fact, the two families which are joined by marriage use a language to describe each other as abakhozi, singular umkhozi, which Jabavu translates as co-parent, when her father speaks about her sisters-in-laws who share similarities with Jabavu's family, who are our people. And this is a quote from the book. They are Bantu like us. Again, like us, they are westernized Africans. More than that, my co-parent, umkhoziwam, is a Christian and a chief. When Madondo writes about his experience of home as a man, it is important to consider this experience from a woman's experience as well. The aim of this description is to illustrate the interplay of family, culture, gender, and race. This is not to suggest that all black women are performing this negotiation. However, this description is helpful for understanding other ways of experiencing home. This description also brings into question the particularities of certain families. All these practices and rituals assume a particular kind of family, the kind of family that Jabavu, which emerges in Jabavu's writing. Jabavu's writing will bring into discussion the issues of class and location, particularly cross-cultural mobility, as Noni Jabavu refers to her marriage to an upper-class British family, while her sister is married to a Ugandan lawyer whom she met while he was studying at Fort Hare University. Jabavu explains that we girls had married and left our old homes for new ones so far away. This conceptual understanding of home illustrates that home is about meaning making and ways of being, which establish one's place in the world. They also raise questions about the theories about women's place in the home and how women's subjectivity is negotiated in the home. The idea that in patriarchal societies, the domestic space was the place of women, while the public realm of culture, politics, and the economy was seen as the sphere of men, can be complicated when we consider that there are women navigating home, the domestic space, in different ways if the ideas of Ekhaya and Mzini are taken seriously. So in the longer paper, I kind of try to locate Noni Jabavu and her writing within this, the idea of African modernity in the early 20th century, particularly before apartheid, because I think African modernity looks very different in the interwar years, sort of between late 1800s to about 1948, effectively. And I guess questions of home and belonging that were happening around that time. And then I tried to locate her and her writing, I guess, within black women's writing at the time. So this section is, I guess, the analysis that I do. And in fact, in the abstract, I kind of didn't edit properly. I'm only looking at drawn in color in this paper, or in this presentation, rather. So according to custom, how Jabavu negotiates home. Jabavu's description of home are peppered with language that highlights the importance of roles and seniority in her family. She's at pains to explain the significance of her brother's death. So this book in particular starts with her coming home because her brother has passed away, and he's a younger brother. Even though he is the youngest, he is the one who would have extended the Jabavu lineage as the son of the family, and she makes a note of this in her writing. This could be read in light of her role as the older sister being diminished because she is a woman who has already been given away to Mzi. However, later events in the memoir reveal a fluidity in this role because she is sent to Uganda to visit her sister, and she takes the role of the eldest when she has to intervene on behalf of her sister who is in an unhappy marriage. It is important to note here that the Xhosa language recognizes the role of the eldest child regardless of their gender through the concept of umafungwashe, which refers to the eldest child in the family, and the youngest is often referred to as undondo or ipelo. The linguistic privileging of family members is significant to Jabavu's writing. So I'm quite deliberate in kind of giving this description because I think the language for me is very important for us to understand the family relations which I'm trying to write about. So Jabavu returns for her brother's funeral after being away from home for many years, with the exception of short trips visiting home. This suggests an insider-outsider relationship with her family, as she writes as though she was simply observing the rituals and the relationships in her family. The nature of her writing is a reflection, and she's able to position herself in a manner that makes the reader question how she locates herself in her family and her community. After her brother's funeral, there are rituals that need to be observed, and her reflection on the rules about the rituals, she says, I thought how there was nothing like a family crisis to enable custom and tradition to be handed down. Jabavu does not seem to be wholly convinced by the custom, but she participates within the understanding that there is no need to question the ritual because the custom seemed to be another of those instinctive ways of expressing a basic need. That's part of the quote. Jabavu's writing about Ekhaya is central to how she writes about her family and her position in her family. She positions herself within an understanding of what it means to be the elder sister, uMafungwashe, in light of her brother's death. This is highlighted in how she recounts her relationship with her father, who refers to her as my support always. I rely on her in everything that requires common sense. This sentiment challenges the argument that daughters are simply the possession of the father until they are passed on to the husband. Jabavu is her father's daughter, and her role in her family is not diminished because she is married. Furthermore, her role as the eldest in her family does not seem to be diminished because of her gender. This brings into question the particularities of Jabavu's family and their ways of being in the family, which can be read as a deliberate socialization which challenges the use of gender as a way to determine how family members are valued. This can be read in conjunction with Oyewumi's critique of Western feminism and gender norms, which organizes social norms according to what she refers to as the biologic, and it's bio-logic, where she says social categories like women are based on body type and elaborated in relation to and in opposition to another category, man. The presence or absence of certain organs determines social position. Much like Oyewumi's analysis of the social organization among the Yoruba, Jabavu's writing raises the same questions amongst Xhosa people. It seems that seniority and one's title in the family is an organizing category in Jabavu's case. It would be dangerous to apply this to all Xhosa families, but there is clearly an urgent need for more research about these categories that are used in contemporary African cultures. What is significant in Jabavu's writing is that her work was published in the 1960s, and it already challenges ideas about Western gender categories used for organizing families. The role of the older sister Ekhaya is further highlighted when Jabavu describes a family meeting, and I'm quoting at length here. My father called me to his study to a representative group of mothers and fathers to be once again addressed on my duty as the eldest daughter to go to my sister on my way back to Europe, to bind her. Their brown eyes and much-lined faces were all turned on me, while one of my uncles spoke for my father, for them all, to remind me of the duties incumbent upon me in my position in the family. I thought how, with my people, you are not often left to be merely your private self. You represent others, or others represent you, so that you are ever conscious of relative status, classification, interdependent relationships, end quote. The meeting is significant as it addresses the concept of ubuntu and its consequence in a practical, value-laden context, because Jabavu's role in relation to her sister is about being conscious of relative status, classification, and interdependent relationships. The role of the uncle who speaks on behalf of her father and the rest of the elders in the room brings into question the idea of the patriarch in African homes who have control in the family. Instead, Jabavu writes about a democratic and shared sense of authority in the family based on the seniority and classification in the form of the uncle who is selected to share authority with Jabavu's father and the other elders in the home. Finally, Jabavu deliberately mentions that the meeting was attended by mothers and fathers. This speaks to the myth that women were not privy to family decisions because this was the role of the men in the family. The idea of the family which Jabavu writes about is not a nuclear family, but rather a network of relationships amongst people who share in the meaning-making process taking place in the home. So this section is about nasemzini and the experiences that kind of shift the focus onto Jabavu's sister when she finally goes and visits her. So nasemzini, Abakhosi, and the country of adoption. Jabavu begins to focus on questions about nasemzini when she writes about visiting her sister in Uganda, and the tensions about her sister's position is questioned because her sister's husband was the first ever African barrister in Kampala, a scion of distinguished and well-to-do family, hardly qualifications for living in a working class estate. So this is how she kind of describes her arrival to visiting her sister. So Jabavu's class sensitivity is highlighted because she believes that by virtue of her brother-in-law's profession, he should not be living in what she describes as a township. This class theme manifests itself throughout her discussion of her sister's marriage and her in-laws. Jabavu's encounter with the brother-in-law highlights her disapproval of him by stripping his home of its significance by referring to it as a house because she could not think of it as home, in a location as it was, and furnished in the way my sister had yet to explain. Jabavu seems to have standards about what constitutes a home beyond the relationships she describes when writing about her family. And it seems the brother-in-law falls short of this standard because she does not feel welcome. In fact, her brother-in-law is not even home to welcome her, even though she expected him to be there to show respect as umkhozi. She constantly makes reference to the aesthetics of her sister's house, and she is concerned about how she is to report back to the family about her sister's living conditions, which do not seem to be an extension of the kind of home her sister was raised in. Jabavu's position as the older sister allows her to write a letter to her father's sister-in-law and addressing him African style as my father, she says. And her letter explains that, and this is the quote from the letter, in my country, the older sister shares the responsibility with senior members of families joined by marriage to adjust matters, if possible, when they go awry in the link between them. So I was therefore approaching him as head of his side, in my capacity as envoy and representative, to ask him, although I was indeed only a child, to come and hold counsel. This positioning highlights yet another debunking of the myth about the role of black women in their families. More importantly, there seems to be a fluidity in identity allowed to Jabavu as the older sister who can occupy the position of both a child and a representative of the elders because she is the eldest. This negotiation with her sister's in-laws, Abakhozi, is happening alongside Jabavu trying to make sense of Uganda and the culture in Uganda. Much of her observations are in fact cringeworthy because she is constantly comparing what she calls the Easterners, Easterners, as she refers to the black people in Uganda, and the Southerners, the black people in South Africa. She's the Southerners. It seems the whole trip is a culture shock for Jabavu, who shares her prejudice while realizing she has a lot to learn about other African countries. Jabavu's sister is finally recalled, and she uses the word recalled interestingly, by her family when her marriage seems to be irreparable. The father's role as the patriarch is once again subsumed into the family identity, where there is no single individual who has the power to make the decisions. There is also no mention of her sister's divorce being a source of shame to the family, especially because the sister returns, the sister goes back to South Africa and then returns again to Uganda and begins a new life for herself as a nurse, while Jabavu lives in Uganda as well as a source, to be a source of support in, I guess, this transition phase of being a single mother because they have a child. Jabavu's sister is not bound to an unhappy marriage. Rather, her family realizes that she can start a new life because she has not been sold, which is a quote from the book as well. She hasn't been sold into another marriage, which makes reference to Ilobola, I guess, but rather the arrangement between two families has not worked out the way that they had hoped. To conclude, Jabavu's writing brings into question beliefs that have become general knowledge or assumptions about African families. Because her book is a reflection of her visits to her family, she does not write from a position of an anthropologist or sociologist making sense of a distant family. Rather, she is an insider writing about the negotiation she participates in when she is with her family. More importantly, her writing shows how the family and the home, and I'm using the word home there, meaning both Ekhaya and nasemzini, to map out the cultural logic of her family and community. Jabavu's writing becomes a text which can be used to theorize and better understand the lives of African people from their own perspective rather than from a perspective of a missionary or a researcher who uses a worldview rather than a world sense. And I'm using this idea of worldview and world sense, again taking from Oyewumi, and I kind of go into detail about it in the longer paper. So for Jabavu, Ekhaya and nasemzini are useful concepts about knowing one's place in the hierarchy and the establishment of roles according to age and title, and brings into question the readings of African families as patriarchal, because even though she is a woman, she is still the eldest and is sent as the emissary to intervene on her sister's marriage. Jabavu is given permission to take the place of the elders, suggesting a fluidity in social organization of her family, and a context-specific way of organizing family, rather than the rigid gender roles which are used to entrench women as nurturers in the home, or the generalizations about African women being oppressed in their families.
Thank you, Ranka. Thank you, Atta. Thank you, Christophe, for fascinating papers. So we're going to open up. I'll take one round of questions. And yes, Jamila, you're too eager to finish my sentence, but yes.
I couldn't wait for you to finish. Sorry, maybe I interrupted you before I raised my hand. But I just wanted to say I liked Atta's paper so much. It's so relatable, Atta. And I'll use my own, I suppose, background as a black woman from Limpopo, and the things you talk about around families, how negotiation happens in a family, the use of gender, but also seniority are just so, if I can use that word, true. They are so true and are so reflective of actually the reality of what happens in African families. And I just wanted to also again just emphasize that gender and this idea of, I don't know if it's a patriarchal idea of seniority. I don't know where you fit seniority, whether it's patriarchal or it's a gender, I don't know, kind of category, is so true that, you know, these things are used side by side. For example, the eldest person in my family is a woman, my sister. And then we have one brother at home who's the last born. But in our home, those two people are used together as, I suppose, people of influence. My sister is the eldest, because she is the eldest. My brother, because he is the only man in the family. So I really loved that thing about your paper that is relatable, and it just speaks to our lived experiences as Africans and as black women. So it's more of a comment.
Yes?
Thank you very much. I was born Russian when I saw Noni Jabavu, because at some point here at Rhodes, my friends started calling me Noni. I was so interested in, you know, what was going on, because there's a contrast in what happens in the South African society compared to the West African society. It's not the same. It's Africa, we have the same challenges, I mean, their convergences and their divergences. When she raised the issue about gender in the family and said Noni was still the head, she was taking decision when they met together, the fact that she was a woman did not, you know, reduce her status. I said, wow, this is great. This is great, because for those of us in West Africa, it's a lot of contrast in family relations. If you have all girls, and I am the first as a woman, I can't take any decision. You will not believe that. I'm just trying to bring a contrastive analysis here. That it's Africa, it's my baby brother who takes the decision for me. Yes, even when I'm trying as much as I can not to be personal here. But I remember that when I got married as an academic staff on campus, my baby brother, who was in the first year in the university, was the one who signed. Yes. He walked, you know, we had to dress him up to represent the family. Yes, first year in the university. And here you have me, big girl, lecturer on campus, getting married, and the representative was my kid brother. I'm old enough to be the mother, 18 years gap. I mean, when he used to come and see me on campus, people thought I had a child. And I was not ready to dispute it whether I had a child or not. It was not an issue. Because my daddy already told him, that's your mother. I have that motherly role. But when it came for some very serious family issues, when I saw this, my baby brother, we had to dress him up like a man, make him big, put a cap, and he walked majestically to come and sign on my the wedding certificate, and that was my father. So you can, yes, he was representing the whole family, and my father, everybody. He walked up majestically. He knows his role. So yes, it's my sister. And then he signed, and they were taking, you know. So this is interesting for me that, you know, South Africa, West Africa, the similarities, the divergences. But in all this, we should just know how to put ourselves, and there was a very strong remark, put ourselves as women and keep moving when I listened to her in that book she talked about, the book she wrote, there was a place where she said she escaped. The book you were talking about, I liked the word escape. When you are faced, I mean, this is not just writing and we go back to our offices. When you are faced with challenges that are life-threatening as a woman, start thinking very fast. Think very fast, because if you don't take, I mean, a man is an architect of his own misfortune. Think fast and think of how to act. Because I don't know what goes on in South Africa. In West Africa, if you don't act, your destiny goes. And I can assure you, when the person goes, well, everybody will forget about you. So you need to think fast. I liked that novel where the woman escaped. Find a way of escaping, like I also escaped. So I'm just sensitizing us, sensitizing other people. We shouldn't just write and then we go. If you see a fellow woman in such a mess, you have to find a way. That's why we are here. That's why we are feminists. Whatever, feminist, womanist, Tiwanist, all of them put together. You know, I said it there that after now, that's a remark I made. After now, what happens? What is feminism to you? I was discussing with my sister. For me, feminism is not about equality. There's equality for everybody. But for me, it's intellectual survivor, economic survivor, marital survivor, political survivor. Just survive. Because if you don't survive and you go, the person will be replaced immediately. Take, for example, for those of us who work in campus, if you're not there to take the lecture, the head of department calls another person to replace you. In 2-3 days, I don't know what goes on here, but don't even bother. You are not, the judge are like, okay, this person is not around. So thank you very much. Let us wake up. Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you, Joy.
Thank you so much to the presenters. I also have a comment and question for Athambile. What is it? Yeah. So of course, yeah, everything you said makes sense, and myself as a Mafungwashe, it's a strong. What is it? So much of my identity is built on being the firstborn and the only girl, you know. And so I think, Noni's work and your use of Oyemi build so much on, yes, on Oyemi's ideas and Amaidume's ideas about how the difficulties of using the concept of sisterhood for Africans, and why it's sort of uncomfortable to say women are unequal, you know, and one of the ways that women are unequal in African societies is because when a woman is then Ekhaya, at home, not in her married family, the people that she's equal with are the brothers, not the brothers' wives. The brothers' wives are less to her in terms of power. And that seems to, I mean, in the ways in which when I watch my mother transition from her married home to how she relates to her brothers and sisters at home, it's quite different, you know. So even though, of course, she's part of the family meetings, you know, at home, the ways in which she acts is quite different, you know. And that somehow, those structures endure. So I wondered, of course, this is part of a PhD and an independent paper, I think. So if it's an independent paper, and in a way to show how, you know, this has sustained. I mean, the Mandela and Makaziwe Mandela case for me illustrates that. So Makaziwe Mandela is a mafungwashe to Mandela. And yet we have the case now of her nephew, Mandla Mandela, wanting to claim patriarchal authority over her, and having people like Chief Patekile Olomisa saying that Makaziwe Mandela's power is now in her married family home in Ghana, which actually is a distortion of how this thing works, because her actual power is in her patrilineage. Her actual power is being a Mandela, a Madiba, not in her married home. So her actions then, if you take Jabavu, if you take Oyewumi seriously, are unsurprising. And so then we find ourselves during the Madiba funeral in this weird space where people like Nokuzola Mdende and Noboniso Gasa have to explain African culture to these African patriarchs like Chief Patekile Olomisa. You know, so I'm wondering if you want to not only leave it, you know, not only to just say, even, you know, as early in the 19th century, you know, in the 60s, this woman was saying this, and how in a sense, it remains to be the case. And yeah, yes, let me stop there.
Thank you for your papers. I was trying to find a way of connecting your papers, and I was thinking of dispossession and how writing becomes a place where you find home and all that that means. And I wonder if we couldn't explore that, and the body as well, écriture feminine, how the body becomes a place wherever that body is, whether it's exiled, dispossessed, and so on. And but even if we resolve it in that way, as Adorno says, and Edward Said's always quoting Adorno, even writing doesn't become a place where you could live. So the condition of being perennially homeless.
Okay, I think we'll pack it there with questions, let them answer, and then we'll...
Being this diasporic nomad.
So, sorry, Leader, please, I was just going to add this, sorry. Is it possible to do a comparative analysis, a West African novel and a South African novel, and then you bring out the relationship ties? Pick up a South African novel, pick up a West African novel, see the family ties, because I see that it's different, and then the points of convergence and divergence.
All right. Atta, do you want to start off with some comments?
Yeah.
There's a general question for Betty to each of you.
Yeah, I think thanks for those comments. And I guess this is part of the struggle of writing a paper like this because it's so familiar and because it's something that I've seen even in my own life. And I guess that's part of the reason why I was attracted to doing Noni Jabavu's work. And so how do we, the question I've constantly been asking myself, even when I was writing this initially, is how do we write, or how do we position ourselves as scholars when we do want to write about things? Because when I showed this paper to a friend of mine, and he had been at the first time I presented this paper, he said, you know, I can see where your discomfort lies in terms of how do you locate this. But the fact is, if I'm going to submit this to a journal, all the whole section about describing sort of explaining the home and everything, that's purely my understanding of home. Some of it is stuff that my mother, I guess, told me and explained. Now, do I quote my mother? And he says, you're going to have to find another book that you can quote. And I'm sitting with this discomfort of, you know, why do we have to do that if we're saying that really our lived experiences must become part of this thing that we call knowledge production? So as much as, I mean, this is an affirming space, unfortunately, a journal review who's probably never been exposed to this woman is not going to be as generous as you guys have been, but thanks for that. And I guess, Betty, writing as a place of finding home, I mean, this is the interesting thing again for me in finding and doing Noni Jabavu's work, in how she's almost been erased and eclipsed. So I'd have to kind of tell the story of how I came across her and why it is that we don't find her books anyway, why it is that I found her books in a Smolanyana shop.
And there was one sold out yesterday.
And there was one sold out yesterday, which I saw someone walking around with. So, but this idea that she's like this treasure that we have to find somewhere, and how then do we help her find home, in a sense, in the fact that we need to remember that her writing has happened, and that her writing was significant for its time, and it's significant for now. So that speaks a lot for me, I guess, in this project of the disposition, but also the erasure of how women have navigated writing and their lives.
She's the first black South African woman to write an autobiographical.
Publishing alongside, so it was Peter Abrams first in the 50s, then it's Ekhaya Mphahlele, I think, in 59, she's 1960 and 63, but it's like we jump her and then we go to Todd Machikiza, we go to Louis Ngosi, because they were the drum generation, and I'm just like, it's not okay. But it's also because those guys were also part of the exile generation, so they leave drum and they go into exile. She's not in exile, technically. So now what do we do with a black person who's living in another country, and she's a woman, and she's writing, and she's not in exile, and she's not quite sure how to relate to the other black people who are coming into the UK around the same time. So it's part of all those questions for me as well.
So you're saying, so she's away, but not exile as political exile, but it's an exile of form.
It's not really an exile because she leaves South Africa because she's gone to study. She leaves when she's 13 years old and she's gone to study. So the plan was always to come, and she also writes about it in the sense that I was always going to come back. So in the preface of the 1982 introduction to Ochre people, she says I was always going to come back. I haven't seen any of her writing, be it her columns, where she describes herself as someone who was exiled. She was going to come back. The reason why she doesn't come back, she kind of describes it as the vicissitudes or the wills of the gods just didn't work out that way. And so she gets married, she doesn't finish her studies, she was going to be a musician or a music teacher, that's what she was studying. She gets married, she has a child, and then she just says life just keeps unraveling. But never does she ever feel exiled until, then it's part of her whole narrative. She gets divorced, she ends up in Zimbabwe, and only ends up in South Africa much later, and she dies here, fortunately for her, because that's what she wanted. So
but
it's
from a very distinguished
very
intellectual family in the Eastern Cape.
Yeah, so that's part of the exile, is that her father had studied overseas, her mother had studied overseas, so she goes overseas to study because that's what they do, not because she's running away from. But she writes about the politics of the time and her relationships with it, but you don't get the sense that she's political in the sense that she's aligned to the ANC or any political party, but she's a political figure in the sense of how she lives her life during that time.
Ranka?
My larger project, this is an offshoot of it, okay? I wanted to try and contribute to this conference, but I'm not really working on life writing, I'm working on fiction. It's to do with how different locations in these regions, and locations are always understood as nations. I don't want to forget the boundaries between nation states. I do understand forms and meanings and cultures and textualities circulate across them. But I think if you look at this region and how formal decolonization came to it, it's very clear that it's very hard and dangerous to make any sweeping generalizations about what happened in Southern Africa or Southeastern Africa, how we want to describe it. So
The boundaries were colonial boundaries.
Yes. They, however, have worked. They are real, they have been in place for a while, and unfortunately they do matter. No one better to understand that than, say, the Zambians, South Africans, Zimbabweans, and Malawians of Norah Mumba's generation, when it wasn't at all the same thing where you found yourself and where you found yourself writing and working and operating. Being in Lusaka and being, in Joburg and being in Salisbury as it was then, was a very different matter. Very different business, being culturally active and productive, and being a man or a woman in those places. And then, of course, that's continued since. I remember this question coming to me at a conference once during the crisis in Zimbabwe. When if you were this side of the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia, you could do certain things. You could get into a car and drive, and then on the other side of the border, you couldn't. So, as somebody who wants to think about the cultural histories of form in this region, I don't think I can lose sight of that. So when I say different cultural locations in the region, that's what I mean, not that they are different in an absolute sense. And so in different locations in the region, people, writers and readers, I think, imagine that the terms you've mentioned, dispossession, body, gender, entitlement, home, freedom, emancipation, differently, in different languages, in different genres. Every one of those locations is capable of producing forms and texts that can be considered beautiful. And yet they are not all equally valued and recognized, because the mechanisms of evaluation and recognition are complex, and some of the most powerful ones find themselves outside of this region. We are now in a country that is a regional center of all kinds of cultural power, but, and here this is why I use the theory to do with world literature in my larger project, to which I didn't refer here at all, but which frames it. This is why I came to think about very, very local cultures and texts, such as the Zambian, in terms of those theorizations. Why is it that certain texts, such as this one, but not really this one, but novels that base themselves in this temporality, disqualify themselves from being appreciated from the so-called global center? Why is it that when I give papers on this, people say, why are you studying this? It's socially conservative and it's pulp. Why is it that certain kinds of imagination or narrative time sell better than others? Why is it that some certain imaginations of narrative time and narrative form in conjunction with certain kinds of authorial bodies sell better than others? This is what interests me. So in writing this paper, I wanted to isolate this kind of temporality, just a snippet, okay, supposedly old-fashioned, supposedly dead, supposedly medieval and outmoded way of imagining suffering and survival, which has done something creative, beautiful, in a place that really needed it, doesn't get a look in to the World Republic of Letters, the African Republic of Letters. Novels that are written like that don't get a look in, and other kinds of novels and stories and narrativities and temporalities do. I want to be able to think about a larger section of this region than is currently thinkable. And if I'm going to do that, I have to give up an understanding of genre as something that is fixed, of form that has inherent value and carries pre-designed meaning. And I also have to accept that sometimes when forms travel, it's not entire forms that travel. Sometimes it's formal elements that travel. My hypothesis is that this way of imagining her life that Norah Mumba used, and she had good reason. She describes on one occasion how she took 2 hours to climb on foot 2 hospital flights of stairs with her ailing husband because there was no one there to help her because she had to walk him up and he was dying. Did life, she was a Bible reader, did she have a right to think she was undergoing an ordeal? Well, hell yeah, I think. This way of imagining time and life and ethics and a good life is actually not dead in this region, would be my contention. I want to see how it's traveled, and I want to see how it's still active in this region today. And if anyone would like to come and speak to me about its life in South Africa, I would really appreciate it. When I was coming in on the plane, I found this article in one of the free papers that they give you at the airport. Story about a woman who's overcome abuse, overcoming all obstacles to forge a new beginning. Look, here it is. Okay, it's a narrative of ordeal. I want to see how it gets into elite lit. I want to see how it gets into the text that we're all studying and that do sell overseas. And then I want to tell my colleague overseas, you know what? You'd better extend your range of reading, because if you want to be cultural analysts, there's a whole lot of stuff that you are missing that is happening in this place that you're interested in. Sorry, this is so long.
The notion of cosmopolitanism and world literature is paradoxically, parochially defined from a Western context.
Exactly.
And part of the project is to
either drop the word because you don't want to live with its baggage, or to re-signify
everything.
So I've argued very as strongly as I could for Zambian, local, village, rural cosmopolitanism, but then you run into a complicated situation where something is emancipatory from one point of view and not emancipatory from another. So that was my article on frontline cosmopolitanism in Zambia. Yes, it was great, and it was actually existing, but it was very, very patriarchal. Okay, so if you read those texts, Zambian women have dealt with it. So I had to give a paper on those two. I think this was a great choice.
I think it's interesting that you bring up this sense of dispossession, this constant search for home, because I think the very intention of cis heteropatriarchal systems is for us to feel not at home in our own bodies, for us to feel not at home in whatever kind of body we occupy, especially so for transgender people, for women, for people that are of different bodily embodiments, so non-binary embodiments, and also for people that are oppressed by white supremacy, and so. the way we're raised, we're not meant to find home in our own body. That's why it's so important for me to write my body into my text, so that I can find home in my own body, so that I can find home in this skin that I occupy, in this gender that I occupy, in various ways. And it becomes important then for me to also write that search for home into my text. And my text, I always want my text to embody that constant looking for, that walking to find, that discovering, that exploring to find home. But in a less academic answer, I would say that I've found a home in the fact that we, as women especially, can hold space for one another, to do the work that we need to be doing, to kind of grapple with cis-heteropatriarchal systems. And I found home in smells and in affect and in emotions held between people, and sounds and tastes. And I was just having a conversation about this last night with someone, and how we find home. And so wherever we go, if we smell certain specific things, we can find home in those things, and we'll know home. And home becomes everywhere then. Home becomes how you find home in people and in yourself, for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right, I am going to take or abuse my position as chair. I'm not going to ask anyone any questions, but I want to just kind of make comments to all of you, because I really enjoyed all your papers. Chantelle, I feel so envious when I had you. You are so embodied in your writing. At points that's why I was like, continue. I just wanted to hear what you said, because you are, I didn't know where the theory was and where, I didn't know, I was lost. Maybe I need you to send me a copy to read. But maybe not, I should have this. But what I liked about your paper and what you highlighted for me is this idea of language, or no, academic writing being phallocentric, what did you use that word? And I thought, gosh, especially for me, I hate psychoanalysis, I hate Freud, because I've never understood it. You articulated it for me. You articulated what it is that I find very uncomfortable with psychoanalysis. And please don't come to me and tell me why I should read it. I will not read psychoanalysis. I will find other theories. And so I found, and what in a way for me, when I finished my doctorate, I was not in my doctorate at all anyway. I wrote in the third person. The entire thesis was in the, and my editor had to, when she was editing, she sent back the proofs and said, where are you in this thesis? And she had to insert me in my own work. And so now when I come here and students say, oh, I'm a tutor coordinator, and they say to students, don't write in the eye. I said, why shouldn't they write in the eye? It is their work. They should write in the eye. Because it's easy. Do you know how hard it is to write in a distance?
Yes.
It was so. I mean, Chantelle, you just did something quite. Thank you so much, Ranka. That embodiedness of that I saw in Chantelle's text, I see also in a distance in Norah. So we don't like what when we were reading what a woman should do, we were like, oh, why no? But that's her. That's what she was saying at that point. But also the way in which you show that what we kind of, some of us are judging, and we were judging part of it. But then you show this transition that she goes through, this period of one's caring for her husband and all those diseases you kind of listed. I was like, oh dear, that's a lot. And then at the end, when you talk about her suffering, and you talk about stepping out of suffering, first accepting it, rejecting it, and then abandoning it, and then finding a way of having a political writing. I think for us to see the transition in herself, which is the transitions we have in our own selves, But also this idea, what is also quite interesting is this idea of widowhood. And I grow from my aunt who raised me was a widow. And she has this kind of authority that I'm beginning to think it's an authority that comes with being a widow, where it's also laughing at, but it's like, I have no time for this stuff. I have children, I have things to do, and this and that, but it gives a certain kind of authority, and it's something that I really want to think about a lot, because even in her widowhood, I was like, but did you ever have, and in her widowhood, she embodies a certain sexuality that she didn't when she was not married, because all of a sudden, yes, I had boyfriends. Of course I had boyfriends. What did you think? I died? Well, no. So I think that was very interesting to hear about. Atta, yours is more question. I don't. I think you started off by saying language. Somebody said language is not enough for your theory, and I'm asking why is it not enough? And your mother, isn't your mother's knowledge, her knowledge of knowing, isn't that a theory in itself? Mm-hmm. And why can't you quote your mother?
These are the questions.
No, I think you can quote. I personally think you can quote. Well, because your mother is not. Because your mother is saying. Sipokazi can understand from the same background is probably what her mother is saying. Yes. And so there's a way in which we can check to see that there's no, like she's not making stuff up. It's not fake news. It's not fake news. It's just something that it's oral tradition of certain kind. So with all that, whatever. Yeah. Sorry to say, but I enjoyed all your papers, and I just wanted to say something. So thank you so much for a brilliant session. And the last is not always whatever. We did save the last. For the last. Thank you so much. And yes, feel free to have tea. They're here. Feel free to come and speak to them. Mingle, play hopscotch and whatever, and we'll see each other at 7 o'clock.